Right, hello everybody, hope you're all doing well. So this is going to be a response to Jordan Peterson's Animal Rights and Wrongs video, in which he argues against the legitimacy of animal rights. So if you don't know who Jordan Peterson is, I have no idea how you found me, but for those who must have quite literally been living under a rock for the past year or two, Jordan Peterson is a clinical psychologist, a Harvard professor and best-selling author of a number of books, as well as possibly the most popular man on the internet right now and chief crustacean to an army of online lobsters. Now, I don't actually share the rage and hate on for Jordan Peterson that a lot of his critics seem to have. In fact, I find myself in large part agreeing with the majority of his work. I mean, yeah, the left is crazy and free speech is awesome and women are weird and stuff, so for the most part I think he makes good points. However, when it comes to the topic of animal rights, he loses me completely. So in this response, I'm going to generously ignore all of the condescension and finger wagging he does in the original video in order to focus on the main gist of each of his points, although these aren't exactly easy to follow in some instances. I'll probably drop a few short clips of the video in as we go to make this easier to follow, but the whole video will be linked below for those who want to watch it in full. As far as I can tell, he basically makes two main arguments in the video, and those are what I'll be rebutting in this response, as well as a few other minor points. The first argument he makes seems to be that because some pro-animal rights academics argue in favour of group rights or believe animal rights to be consistent with a broader framework of group rights, animal rights are somehow invalidated as a concept. I'm not sure I really understand this point, to be honest, and after researching a little bit about the concept of group rights, I'm still none the wiser as to how this is supposed to constitute a rebuttal of animal rights. His second argument is essentially that animals are not entitled to rights because they are incapable of engaging in social contracts, or in other words, agreeing to conform to a predefined set of rules. According to Jordan Peterson, only those capable of this kind of reciprocity have any claim to rights. In response to the first group rights point, I guess I'd simply restate his assertion back to him as a question and ask, who's really arguing for group rights in this scenario? The person who believes that only moral agents as a group are entitled to rights and that the well-being of individuals who are not in that group is essentially ethically unimportant, or the person who argues that those who exist within the purview of a civilized society should be afforded some level of ethical consideration according to their individual capacities to suffer and experience harm. I'd genuinely like to hear how attempting to treat each individual being according to their individual capacities is somehow a group rights argument, but arbitrarily assigning rights to the group you just happen to belong to based on an irrelevant cognitive ability is an individual rights argument. So either he's arguing that all humans are entitled to rights because they are human, which would be a kind of group rights argument, or he is arguing that humans are entitled to rights because they have the cognitive capacities necessary to engage in reciprocal transactions. At this point, I think it's fair to point out the irony of an experienced clinical psychologist attempting to argue that an individual's right not to be stabbed to death and eaten or beaten to death for fun is basically contingent on their cognitive abilities. I mean, I assume if he were to treat a severely cognitively impaired client or delusional psychiatric patient, that he would afford them their basic right to life, despite their inability to reciprocate. Now, this brings me properly onto what seems to be the main argument made in the video, and one I'll continue to beat on throughout this response, and that is the idea that animals are not worthy of rights because they're incapable of reciprocity and therefore unable to engage in social contracts. According to Jordan Peterson, in order for an individual to be entitled to rights, they must be capable of holding responsibilities. This is, however, little more than an assertion and leaves our aforementioned psychiatric patients and severely cognitively impaired human beings with no entitlement to rights whatsoever. If Peterson wants to make the argument that rights and responsibilities are inseparable in this sense, he needs to account for the existence of countless people who hold rights despite having diminished responsibilities and duties, such as children, psychiatric patients, people suffering from severe brain damage, AIU fans, elderly people with dementia, etc, etc, etc. And given that this is one of the oldest animal rights arguments in the book, known as the argument from marginal cases, Peterson really should have dealt with it in his video. I would also argue that the social contract has very little to do with ethics and much more to do with simply maximising self-preservation. Agreeing not to kill your neighbour because they agree not to kill you says very little about what is actually good in the abstract, and in this sense the only real good in a society based purely on the social contract is conformity to the contract regardless of its content. So what do we say of a man who opposes a social contract based on his own sense of justice? Is he automatically unjust? Does Nazism become good if everybody in the world signs up to it? Is female genital mutilation good if it is part of the social contract in the given society in which it occurs? These are questions, of course, that only Jordan can answer. You see, Peterson argues that reciprocity is the cornerstone of ethics, I guess on the assumption that one corner is all we need. And as much as I agree that reciprocity is certainly important, to say I'll only respect those who can force me to respect them is to dispense entirely with the principle of respect, and to say I'll only afford compassion to those who can hurt me if I don't is to show no compassion at all. An ethical framework built on reciprocity alone dispenses with all other virtues and leaves us with nothing but brute force and conformity. Hardly a very Christian position. Now, in the interest of Steelman in Jordan's position, I think there's something worth mentioning here, although I should point out that he didn't make this point directly in the video I'm addressing. If we accept that everything that conforms to the social contract is ethical, what makes one social contract better than the other? In my opinion, the most important metric by which different social contracts could be reasonably compared is the degree to which they preserve well-being. However, Jordan seems to measure the worth of a social contract on its sustainability across time.
You should act so that things are good for you like they would be for someone you're taking care of. But they have to be good for you in a way that's also good for your family. And they have to be good for you and your family in a way that's also good for society. And maybe even also good for the broader environment if you can manage that. So it's balanced at all those levels. And then that has to be good for you and your family and society and the world right now and next week and next month and a year from now and 10 years from now. And so it's this harmonious balancing of multiple layers of being simultaneously, and that's a Darwinian reality, I would say.
So in order for something to be good, it must be sustainable for the individual, the society and the world across time. Now, unfortunately for Jordan's argument here, the one thing our current consumption of animals certainly isn't is sustainable across time.
When Europeans first came to the New World, they encountered sea life in quantities that stagger modern imagination. Lobsters, so common that only the poor would eat them, reached 20 pounds. Massive oyster beds yielded dinner plate-sized specimens. In a single day, a fisherman could hook 600 giant sturgeon, which could weigh a ton. On Crane Beach, north of Boston, the shellfish would pile up 3 feet thick after a nor'easter. I've been there recently after a storm. On 4 miles of beach, I found a lobster trap, a horseshoe crab, dead, and 1 starfish. I found that painful.
Jordan also states that animal rights arguments are based in pity, but that his argument is based in the principle of judgment, which is obviously way more alpha. But this is clearly an attempt to reframe any animal rights argument as an appeal to emotion, while at the same time placing himself firmly in the realm of objectivity and rational argumentation. However, the vast majority of pro-animal rights thinkers subsume their arguments for animal rights within a harm reduction framework for which no pity is required. Simply accepting the fact that unnecessary suffering and pain is bad and should be minimized is all that's necessary to adopt this approach to ethics.
Well, so what do you do in the face of that suffering? Try to reduce it. Make the suffering in the world less.
And of course, this is the ultimate irony of Jordan Peterson's attack on animal rights. For someone who claims to have studied Nazi Germany for decades, who talks endlessly about how great it is to reduce the amount of suffering in the world, and who claims to base their actions in sound judgment, to then argue in favour of the continuation of a completely unnecessary, unsustainable Holocaust on the basis that the victims are cognitively inferior is mind-blowing in its absurdity. So thanks for listening, everybody. Hope you enjoyed this video. Please hit the like button on your way out and share this video around if you want more people to see it. and also consider donating via the PayPal link below or signing up to my Patreon for more content and stuff. Cheers, I'll see you in another video.